the storyline of the Bible read by Kathy Bird.
The arrest of Jesus. Jesus and the disciples leave the city and go to a garden at the Mount of Olives to pray, and he tells them they will desert him tonight. They protest and say they will not, but Jesus says, "It is written in the scripture, I will strike the shepherd, and the flock will be scattered." Peter tells Jesus he would never desert him, but Jesus says, "I give you my word, before the rooster crows tonight, you will deny that you even know me 3 times. Peter replies, "Even though I have to die with you, I will never disown you." The other disciples join in with Peter, saying they would never disown Jesus too. Jesus prays for the disciples so they will be protected and be able to spread the good news that he gave them. He tells them to stay awake and be on the lookout while he takes Peter, James, and John and goes a short distance to pray. Then Jesus tells the 3 to stay there and keep watch with him. Jesus goes a little farther and drops to the ground in sorrow and prays, "My Father, if it is your will, take away this suffering that is about to happen to me. But even though I don't want to go through this, let your will for me be done." Jesus comes back and wakes Peter and says, "How is it that you 3 were not able to keep watch with me for even 1 hour? Keep watch and pray that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Twice more Jesus goes to pray and comes back to find them sleeping. Finally he wakes them up and tells them his betrayer is here. Judas comes, and with him a group of Roman soldiers and some temple guards sent by the chief priests and elders. They arrest Jesus, and the disciples become scared and run away. More information can be found in the book of Matthew, chapter 26, verse 36, also in Mark 14:32, Luke 22:39, and John 18. The trial of Jesus. Jesus is taken to the house of the high priest, where other members of the council are waiting to question him. Peter and John follow to see what is going to happen to Jesus, but Peter is recognized as a follower of Jesus. It is here that he denies knowing Jesus 3 times. Then he hears a rooster crow, remembers what Jesus had told him, and goes away and weeps bitterly. The chief priests and elders seek many false witnesses to testify against Jesus so they can kill him, but no evidence can be found to support their charges. Finally, Caiaphas, the high priest, says to Jesus, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Jesus answered, "I am, and you will all see the Son of Man seated at the right of the Almighty and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tears his robes and says, "We don't need any more witnesses. You heard his blasphemy, to speak lightly or carelessly of God." After hearing this, they all vote that Jesus is guilty and should be put to death. Early the next morning, the whole assembly brings Jesus to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor appointed for Judea. Pilate questions Jesus privately and finds him innocent. The Jews become angry and start to protest. When Pilate learns that Jesus is from Galilee, he sends him to Herod, the governor of Galilee, who happens to be in Jerusalem. Herod is delighted to see Jesus, whom he has heard so much about, and is hoping to see him perform a miracle. Jesus does not respond to Herod's questioning despite the strong accusations made by the chief priests and teachers of the law. Herod makes no charge against Jesus, but he and his soldiers make fun of him and treat him with contempt. Then they put a fine purple robe on him and send him back to Pilate. Pilate calls together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and explains that he nor Herod have found Jesus guilty of anything deserving death, so he will have Jesus whipped and set free. The Jews are stirred to protest and tell Pilate Jesus should die. Every year at Passover, Pilate sets free a prisoner. He taunts the Jews by asking them, "Which one do you want me to set free for you, Jesus Barabbas? He was in prison for riot and murder? Or Jesus called the Messiah? He knows that Jesus has been handed over because the Jewish authorities are jealous. Pilate's wife sends him a message. Have nothing to do with that innocent man, because in a dream last night I suffered much on account of him. The chief priest and elders persuade the people to ask Pilate to release Barabbas and put Jesus to death. Then Pilate asks the crowd, what crime has he committed? They start shouting, "Crucify him!" Pilate takes Jesus and has him whipped. The soldiers make a crown out of thorny branches to pierce his head and dress him in the fine purple robe that came from Herod. They put a stick in his hand and chant, "Long live the King of the Jews!" They kneel before Jesus and make fun of him. They slap him, spit on him, and take the stick and hit him. After the soldiers have their time with Jesus, Pilate brings him out before the crowd wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe to show them Jesus had been punished by being whipped, scourged, and humiliated. When the chief priest and elders see Jesus, they start shouting, "Crucify him!" Pilate tries to argue back, saying, "I find no reason to condemn him." The Jews answer back, "We have a law that says he ought to die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." Pilate becomes afraid and takes Jesus back in the palace for more questioning. Pilate again comes before the crowd attempting to free Jesus, but the Jews shout back, "If you set him free, that means you are not the emperor's friend. Anyone who claims to be a king is a rebel against the emperor." When Pilate hears these words, he washes his hands in front of the crowd, saying, "I am not responsible for the death of this man. This is your doing." The people publicly accept the responsibility of putting Jesus to death. Then Pilate hands Jesus over to the soldiers to be crucified. More information can be found in the book of Matthew, chapter 26, verse 57, also in Mark 14:53, Luke 22:63, and John 18:19. The Crucifixion of Jesus. It is about 9 o'clock in the morning when they lead Jesus, carrying a cross, outside the city walls of Jerusalem to the place where they will crucify him. Along the way, the soldiers force a man named Simon from Cyrene to carry Jesus' cross. At a place called Golgotha, Jesus is crucified and hangs on a cross, bleeding to death from the scourging and where the nails pierce his hands and feet. Jesus says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing." Author's note: Golgotha means a bald, round, skull-like mound. The place had the appearance of a skull when viewed from a short distance. After the soldiers crucify Jesus, they take his clothes and divide them among themselves and gamble for the robe, which is made of woven cloth without any seams. This was written in Scripture by David in Psalms 22, verse 18. They divided my clothes among themselves and gambled for my robe. Pilate writes a notice on parchment and has it nailed on the cross above Jesus' head, which reads, "Jesus, the King of the Jews." It is written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests want Pilate to change it to, "This man said, I am the King of the Jews." Pilate's response is, "What I have written stays written." 2 criminals are also crucified with Jesus, one on each side of him. One taunts Jesus, saying, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." The other one speaks to the one taunting Jesus and says, "Don't you fear God? We deserve what we are getting because of what we did, but he has done no wrong." And he says to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus tells him, "I promise you that today you will be in paradise with me." Jesus sees his mother and the disciple John standing near the cross. He says to his mother, "He is your son," and he says to John, "She is your mother." From that time, the disciple took her to live in his home. At about noon, the sun stops shining and darkness covers the whole country until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when Jesus cries out, my God, why did you abandon me?" These words start the 22nd Psalm written by David, which describe the feelings of Christ on the cross and the glory which will be given to him by all nations of the world. Jesus says, "I am thirsty," and someone runs up with a sponge soaked in sour wine, puts it on the end of a stick, and holds it up to Jesus' lips, and Jesus cries out in a loud voice, "Father, it is finished. In your hands I place my spirit." Then he dies. At that moment, the earth shakes, rocks split apart, and the curtain hanging in the temple is torn in two. This curtain separated the symbols of the Jewish religion, altar of incense, the table of showbread, and the 7-branched lampstand, from the room reserved for God. When the captain of the guard and the soldiers who are keeping watch over Jesus see the earthquake and all that happens, they say, "He really was the Son of God." The Jewish authorities did not want to have the men who were being crucified left on the crosses during the Sabbath, so they got permission from Pilate to break their legs so they would die sooner. As they were doing this, they come to Jesus and see he is already dead, so they do not break his legs. But John saw one of the soldiers pierce Jesus' side with a spear, making 2 scriptures come true. Not one of his bones will be broken, and people will look at him whom they pierced. More information can be found in the book of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 32, also in Mark 15:21, Luke 23:26, and John 19:17.